Hi, I'm Jonathan Sharp, and welcome to another installment in the 14 Days of jQuery. I'm one of the jQuery team members, and I work on the infrastructure team with Mike Hostetler. So we're excited to bring this series to you today. I'm going to be talking about jQuery in the enterprise, which is one of the more emerging topics within the project since its inception back in 2006. So let's get started. So first off, when adopting jQuery into the enterprise, one of the important things to consider is the licensing, and jQuery really excels at this because it's a MIT license. So a lot of costs that are associated with other large enterprise packages don't exist with this project. So that's the first benefit, great sell. Second is resources and talent that you need to bring in, obviously, to use jQuery effectively within your enterprise. And that is something that I'll talk about more in a second here. But that's been improving greatly, as I know some enterprises had a hard time staffing experienced developers in this area. And thirdly, the lifespan of the project. How long is that technology going to be around? And what's the risk in adopting it only to have it become dormant a few months later? So especially when you're in an enterprise environment, the lifespan of a particular implementation is much longer than you would see in other situations. So let's address these three topics now. So first off, licensing. I mentioned before, MIT license. Most enterprises, that is the preferred license as opposed to the GPL and some other ones. So we'll continue passing on through that. That's taken care of. Now, resources and talent. This is an area where the market has created demand, and that demand is really catching up, and there's a response to it. And one of the ways that you can gauge this is through the number of books and resources that are available, which you'll see on the screen here. There's a number of books that have been coming out. And if you look at the 2010 schedule, publishers are picking up the topic of jQuery as fast as they can. So that's an encouraging sign. That shows that the market is there, the demand is there, and so the response of talented and experienced developers is really being fulfilled now. So that helps mitigate the risk there a bit. And then another aspect is the number of conferences that are taking place. Specifically the jQuery conference, which the previous years we've done one a year, and with 2010, this is the first of 4. So there's really an opportunity to engage with the community, get involved, and with 2010, the geographic dispersity of our conferences, with this one being all over the world on the internet, and San Francisco and London and Boston wrapping up the rest of the year. And finally, the books and publications, again, which I just mentioned. You can see some of the ones that are offered on the screen. This is just a small sampling of what's involved. Finally, the lifespan of jQuery itself. Having initially been created in 2006, it's come a long way. And as we walk through, you'll notice that on the jQuery.com homepage, there's a list of all of the enterprises that have started adopting it. And it's not a small list at all. That's a small sampling. Anything from Google to Amazon to AOL, which we're at here right now. And so that's really a sign of the stability of the project and enterprises putting their trust and weight behind it. So if you haven't adopted it yet in your enterprise, now's the time to seriously consider it. And this is an impressive statistic which came out in September of 2009 at the jQuery conference, in that according to the statistics of builtwith.com, jQuery is running on 1 in 5 sites on the entire internet. Or if you like percentages, that's 20%. So at that point of, at that size of scale, it's really a solid thing to get behind. And additionally, or finally, the prolific community that exists. That's one of the things that's made jQuery a success. So, it's an excellent technology, but the people surrounding it in the community are a huge resource and asset. And that's one of the things to determine the vitality of the project. So hop on the new Google, the new forums. The Google groups are going away, but we're moving to a forum format, and you'll see the type of questions and responses that are being asked. So let's now take a moment and look at kind of a checklist. And I'm going to go through a series of concepts here. You'll notice I'm not going to go into great detail in a number of them, because there's a number of other presentations that call out in great detail that specific aspect of it. But I'm going to give you a broad approach of what you need to look at to start bringing jQuery into your enterprise. So the first step would be downloading or integrating it. And this is really a basic one, but in a lot of smaller sites, they'll link to jQuery, which is hosted on Google's CDN. In an enterprise environment, you probably are going to want to host it yourself, from a risk management type standpoint, because Google has gone down on a few occasions, and you don't want to have that dependency there. So there's really kind of two decisions on how you're going to host it. One is, depending on how your page is architected, you can link to it directly on your site. So in this example here, we have cdn.example.com. So assuming your enterprise has a CDN or content delivery network, you're going to post a version of jQuery. And one of the things really worth noting here is the use of the version number in the URL itself. It's tempting to just link to jQuery.js, but with the size and scope of applications being built, it's not always possible to do a full upgrade to the latest, greatest version of jQuery when it immediately comes out. So that versioning protects you. So that's an important point. And then the other kind of side to that is if your application bundles all of your jQuery content in some type of global file. And in that case, you'll want to look at the point of where to integrate jQuery into your build process for generating that global. At one project I was working on, we had a series of Ant tasks, and one of those was to include jQuery in that. And we had the option to version our global include then. So that's kind of step one. Once you've got that taken care of, and that's going to vary slightly depending on enterprise to enterprise. Then the next real kind of move towards effectively using jQuery is to identify patterns, development patterns that take place within your organization. So there's really 4 core aspects of jQuery development that patterns can be identified with. And the first is style. So that's going to be your CSS, your presentation, and then structure is next. That's going to be your actual markup, the doc type you're using, etc. And then behavior, so your event binding, and data. So any metadata or attribute that you're using to encapsulate additional information about what your application is dealing with. So first off, style. CSS class conventions is one of the first things when you walk in to look at an existing solution, how it's been implemented, is just the wide variety in which different groups or different developers even name their CSS classes. So when you look at setting up a standard for developers to follow, you're ensuring the long-term maintainability of developers, especially as there's some attrition, developers leave, new developers are hired. This is a critical component here to maintaining an effective integration of jQuery. So in this example here, you'll notice we have a org.header. It's kind of a common practice to use a TLA or a 3-letter acronym to prefix your CSS classes. And in that first bullet point there, org.header, that's going to kind of be a global element. It's going to be uniform across all of the pages. And we'll get to that in a little bit there in terms of scoping. And then finally, there's a org.module. So if you have a development group that's using or implementing a particular module for your application or your enterprise, giving them kind of their own namespace is very effective. And that's especially as you get into large implementations that start integrating various aspects of a application. So your traditional portal type solution, namespacing is something that's very critical there to consider. So make sure you have something set out in that. And the capitalization is style. Some use camel case, some use Hungarian notation. There's really no difference in that implementation as long as it's consistent. So that's something to set forward for your developers. And a great place to do that is on a corporate wiki of development practices. And then finally, the use of classes versus ID. So you'll see that as you look at development, as developers develop, they'll tend to use classes all the time, or they'll tend to use IDs. And then sometimes it's a mix of both. So it would be helpful to help clarify what situation is preferred. And with IDs, The one thing to watch out for is that they have to be unique within the entire document. And within larger enterprises, in the diversity in developers and the number of developers working on a particular page, that can become an issue. And that's usually a harder bug to identify in a page. So if you start testing and a particular implementation isn't working, it very commonly can be that there are multiple IDs on the page. So if possible, use a class-based selector and way to do styling. At the global level, it's excellent to use IDs. And again, I don't want to say that you always want to use classes, but it's just, that's a point to consider within your organization. So structure, markup structure. The first thing to standardize on is the document type, and that can affect the actual rendering of the page, specifically within Internet Explorer, which, as we all know, takes a little bit of finesse sometimes. So this is one of those areas where there's been a lot of improvement since early 2000, when web development was just really kicking off in terms of applications. So this is, but again, something to consider. Making sure that you have a standard uniform doc type across all of your implementations and modules. And this is really something that's handled at kind of the global scope or the overall of your application. Next is, let's say, for example, you have a two-column layout that's prevalent throughout a lot of your designs or interface components. Developing a standard way that a two-column layout should be integrated is the first step in identifying the structure that is going to be prevalent within your organization. So some developers use tables to do that. Others use floated CSS columns. It's really beneficial to have kind of an overarching group that will develop this type of basic layout and component. Another one is a button. In a number of organizations I've worked with over the years, you'll see that buttons are implemented in multiple different ways. So setting forth the standard for how a button would be marked up, so whether you're using an input tag or an anchor tag, and there's a number of reasons why you would use one or the other, from accessibility to graceful degradation. But that's something to consider. And finally, error messaging. There's a number of ways in which the actual presentation of errors is handled across an organization. And this is one of the things where you start introducing consistency by providing a framework, if you would, or a pattern for which developers can follow to implement that messaging. So moving on to behavior now, events and behavior is an area where there can, again, be a wide variety of development patterns that take place here. There's a number of talks that have been given during the 14 days of jQuery, as well as past conferences that are available online. So in this example here, we'll notice that the first one is using a selector and then the traditional bind method. And this is a very acceptable method of binding events. It's actually one that I usually prefer over the shorthand, but that's just a personal preference. And then secondly, there's the shortcut click method. And finally, the use of live events, which is a subtle difference in event delegation, which we'll talk about shortly. But understanding and making it clear for your developers on when to use what. So in the first case, the difference between bind and click is very minimal. It's, like I said, click is a shortcut for the bind. But if you start using namespaced events, for example, then using bind is a real advantage, because that's the only way it can be implemented. So again, the wiki is a great resource. You should really have one set up to start identifying these conventions and patterns within your organization for effective use of jQuery. And then finally, with live being event delegation, there's the underlying understanding that needs to take place. So you don't want to use live everywhere throughout your application, but there are definitely places, such as when you're loading in a lot of content via Ajax or dynamically, that live is a huge benefit. And also the concept of event delegation. So live packages that up for you, but there's also a way where you can use event delegation, just implementing an event handler higher up in the document, and when that event's triggered, it bubbles up to get handled. So it's one of those concepts that can be a little difficult to pick up at first, but one that needs to be watched for in a development environment where you have a wide variety of developers, and the goal is maintainable code in the long run. So that's a concept to really make sure that you have a set of tutorial links, and we'll be posting additional resources to some of these concepts at the end of this video. Well, actually on this web page, so take a look there. And then custom events. Yehuda Katz has an excellent presentation that he gives on the evented model and making use of custom events, which is an effective way when you're integrating between a specific piece of functionality that's usually encapsulated within a module and kind of the global or overall structure of the page. And custom events are great because it gives you separation of concerns. A particular module can export an event, such as if you have an address book and it loads via AJAX and you want to provide the data that was loaded to another piece of functionality on the page. So let's say that you had the listing of addresses and another area that needed to get the count. When that AJAX request comes back, you can trigger a custom event such as addresses available, which would pass back the data, and then that other piece of code that's listening for that event can do a count on it to update that separate part of the page. Now, the benefit for using custom events is that there isn't that dependency. So if the functionality of listing a count is not a requirement on the particular use of that module, it won't break anything. So I'll make sure that we have some links, some additional resources on that pattern. Finally, data is the fourth really core aspect of doing an overall assessment of how you're integrating jQuery. So data really encompasses the use of metadata that's associated with various elements. So in this example that's on the screen here, you'll see that we're using the data attribute, which is part of this HTML5 spec, which is absolutely valid to use today. It's not a conforming attribute, but it doesn't break anything, and its actual implementation is consistent across all of the browsers. And then another approach is to use hidden input fields, or using the actual data method, which attaches data to the DOM itself, not in markup per se. So clarifying this, because some developers will tend to use one method versus the other, and again, we're looking for kind of a consistent approach of how to attach this metadata to the document. And again, with the data attribute, that's one that may not be as readily discernible when going back and maintaining code. Because if you're using Firebug, for example, you won't see that data actually attached to that DOM node, or the rendered markup there that's displayed. So this is the kind of, again, one of the really core concepts which was mentioned previously, and it's the understanding of global versus local scope within an application. So, and this isn't necessarily in terms of your traditional programming global and local scope, but more within the demarcation between the application header or the overall architecture of a site and specific modules or pieces of functionality. Because usually the crossover between the two is that there's two separate development teams. And if there isn't, that's something to consider, or at least have a point team that has the overall architecture. The benefit is that they really provide a lot of services and utilities and additional layers of abstraction that benefit your organization by providing some of that more complex, consistent behavior that's used everywhere and providing an elegant API for the module developer to use. Global typically provides utilities and tools that module developers will use for implementation. So an example of this in practice would be a default action or a default behavior. So based on how your application is built, a common practice is when you hit enter somewhere on the form, it will submit that. Well, if you're using AJAX or you're canceling the actual default browser event, you'll need to implement this type of capability. So each developer that has a module can go through and implement a capture or the resubmitting the form. But what we're looking at here is an ability for the overall architects of the site to implement that handler, and then developers would have the ability then to just add an action default class to make use of that. One final area as we move along here is Ajax. There's a number of different ways in which you can implement Ajax. And there's the use of the Ajax start and stop events. And that's a great way to integrate in the global scope and kind of handle the Ajax messaging that takes place, rather than having each individual developer handle these specific events. And a way that you can do that is through using an envelope pattern. Scott Gonzalez has a great initial implementation that this is built upon here. And you'll notice that in this first sample here, we have a status message. So the purpose of this would be that every Ajax request that comes back from the server that's using JSON would be in this format. And the payload of the data that that particular service would return is in the area where it says object/value. So that can be an array or a literal object. That aspect isn't really of concern to the global handler here. And then triggering a status or an error. And if we play this out again, you can actually add a type attribute here to specify the type of message coming back. Another area, another question that exists that really comes up a number of times is plugins. When do you write your own, and when do you pull in external ones? So when to write your own? When you have a concise piece of functionality that really is tightly encapsulated, that's a great way or a great opportunity to identify the use of a plugin. So an example would be a utility method here, and this is just an example. This could be reduced more, but the use of .values, which will return the values for all of those elements in the collection here. This is the type of a utility method that would be great to implement for your developers. So UI functionality is another area where you have a widget that's common across your entire enterprise. That's an excellent place for using a plugin or writing your own. Avoid using the plugin pattern when in the traditional sense of object method and for organizing your code like that. It should really perform a specific action either on a jQuery object or on a UI component itself. And some guidelines for including external plugins. First, look at the release date. With the volume of plugins that are out there, some of them are dormant and some are not. Some are in more active release status. So take a look at that release date. Actually open up the source code. Make sure that you have the source code and not just a minified or packed version, which some plugins just deliver that. And that can be a point of maintenance issue if you have to modify or patch that. And finally, you can develop an improved list of plugins for your organization. I would caution upon an open policy of use whatever plugin you want, just because of some of the performance issues that are there and the quality control. So within your organization, make sure you have a list. You can have developers submit you suggestions for plugins for that list, but make sure that there's some type of standard process for pulling those in. And one of the things to check too is the licensing on a specific plugin. Most of them use the MIT license as jQuery does, but others have some varying licenses. So that's a thing to consider there. And finally, code organization. Object literals is a very nice pattern, specifically with the new jQuery proxy method, which gives you a nice way to work with that type of interface. There's been a number of presentations on the object pattern itself by Rebecca Murphy, for example. And then finally, the DUI or dig user interface. This is a newer advancement, separate from the jQuery project itself, but something that really may be worth taking a look at. It has some, it's very concise library that provides a nice pattern for wrapping up and encapsulating a series of functionality in a more traditional programming pattern. So finally, training and support. That's one thing to look at. As jQuery itself is an open source project, so there's no commercial entity behind it. But as you may have heard, some of the team members have started a company called Pen2, which specifically caters to the enterprise for training and support. So that's an option and something to consider as you're doing your risk analysis, what's available should we need additional help. So I'll make note of that here. And finally, I am Jonathan Sharp, and you can find me on Twitter at jdsharp as well as jdsharp.com. Once again, enjoy the 14 days of jQuery.